At my cousin's celebration, they told me to smile for a family photo, but I wasn't even in the frame. I hadn't been in years. Then the muted TV behind the bar lit up breaking news. The Pentagon had just confirmed the youngest general in U.S. history, and it was me. My name, my face, my story they'd buried. Every fork froze. My father spilled his wine. My sister's smile cracked mid-toast. This is not just about revenge. It's about what happens when truth survives everything designed to erase it. If you've ever been invisible to the people who should have clapped for you first, stay with me. This story was written for you. The champagne had just been poured. Across the long linen-covered banquet table, glasses clinked with a hollow kind of joy. My father stood first, raising his flute, his voice echoing through the polished oak dining hall my uncle had rented for the occasion. To family, he said, beaming, and to those who make us proud. Everyone turned to Savannah, my cousin, her new government badge pinned to her blazer like a medal of honor, her hair perfectly set, her smile rehearsed. She'd just been accepted into a defense analyst position at the Pentagon, not even in yet, but already the room looked at her like she was carrying the nation's secrets in her purse. Cameras flashed. Her mother dabbed tears. Her boyfriend, some guy from an Ivy school who called everyone sir, too often squeezed her hand like he'd won the lottery. And me, I was sitting at the far end of the table, alone, unnoticed. Someone behind me, Aunt Carol, maybe leaned in and whispered, "Don't slouch, sweetheart. You'll ruin the photo." I wasn't in the photo. I hadn't been in years. I adjusted my posture anyway. Old habits. The toasts rolled on. Savannah's intelligence. Her drive. Her future. How she was carrying the family torch into the heart of national security. I sipped from my water glass lukewarm and ignored. My mother hadn't made eye contact with me all evening. My father, ever the life of the party, had earlier made some crack about how one of his daughters played soldier and disappeared. It earned him a few chuckles. They used to say I was the strong one. Now they acted like I'd retired early from a job they never believed I had. The sound system shifted to soft, instrumental jazz. I watched the condensation slide down my glass, timing the drops. At one point, Savannah stood for an impromptu speech, charming and polished. She thanked her mentors, her parents, even her college roommate, for believing in her vision of service. She did not mention me. Not that she should have. I wasn't on any invite list, technically. I'd shown up because Aunt Carol sent a message out of guilt. I hadn't seen most of them in nearly a decade. And honestly, they seemed fine with that. Then it happened. Behind the bar, the flat-screen TV had been muted all evening, showing slow sports highlights looping in silence. Now it flashed red. Breaking news. The bartender reached for the remote and turned up the volume halfway, just as the segment switched. Pentagon confirms identity of covert strategist behind international hostage recovery, the anchor said, sharp and clear. Previously unnamed due to the classified nature of her operations, the Department of Defense now acknowledges Captain Rowan Hale as the leading mind behind Operation Echo Recovery, credited with saving 21 lives across 3 Allied territories. Forks froze. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the background jazz seemed to hesitate. And then my face. On screen, not smiling, not posed, in full fatigues, rank clear. Campaign ribbons gleaming. A photo I'd almost forgotten existed snapped after the debrief of the operation they said would never be spoken of again. The scroll beneath the anchor read, Captain Rowan Hale, youngest strategic commander ever acknowledged by Department of Defense. No one said a word, not even Savannah. Her smile, bright and breathless moments ago, didn't have time to fade, it shattered. My father's hand trembled, wine spilling onto the pristine white cloth in front of him. My mother blinked as if seeing something through fog, then looked away. And me, I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just sat there still as stone, watching the screen like I was watching a stranger. Because they hadn't clapped for me when I needed it. They hadn't asked where I went. They hadn't even remembered how. The last time I came back to Missouri was 9 years ago. And if it hadn't been for Aunt Liz practically guilting me into it, I wouldn't have come then either. It was a backyard barbecue classic Midwest. Dylan, my cousin, had just been awarded a full ride to West Point, and the family acted like he'd already won a Medal of Honor. Tents stretched over the field behind Uncle Dean's barn, red checkered tablecloths flapping in the breeze, the smell of overcooked ribs mixing with citronella and overcompensation. I showed up in jeans and a plain black shirt, hair pulled back, no uniform, no rank, no evidence of who I was or what I'd done. I didn't come to make a statement. I came to blend in, to observe, not be observed. But camouflage doesn't work in families. As soon as I stepped through the gate, I felt the shift. The way conversations dipped, then redirected like I wasn't there. Like I was a ghost who had wandered in by mistake. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," someone muttered, mouthful of potato salad. "Still driving trucks for the army?" another voice chimed. "Or have they finally let you go? I thought she dropped out of school to play GI." "Jane," someone laughed behind a red Solo cup. I smiled without showing teeth. Let it roll off like I'd been trained to do. They didn't know. They didn't want to know. They didn't know I'd spent the last 4 years under Black Ops clearance, name redacted from every system. Didn't know I'd designed the tactical blueprint for a hostage recovery operation so sensitive that even our allies only heard whispers about it. They had no idea what it felt like to fly into the Caucasus Mountains on 3 hours' notice, frost biting through Kevlar with intel so vague it might have been written in crayon. They didn't know that the mission had called for extraction of 12 civilians, engineers mostly, but we found 21. Some were children. One was a pregnant woman who'd gone into labor inside a makeshift cell. Command said we didn't have time to get them all out. Triage, they said. Take the primary targets. I said no. I split the unit, delayed exfiltration, used emergency flares and misinformation to buy time. We carried the kids out in our arms one by one. I loaded the last of them onto the evac chopper as the sun started bleeding over the horizon. No one died that night, except my career. When we got back, there were no medals, no debrief, just silence. The official log listed the mission as successful due to coalition coordination. No names, no credit. My service record was quietly sealed. Judgment compromised under duress, the internal memo read. They didn't court-martial me. That would have required admitting I existed. Back at the barbecue, Aunt Liz handed me a paper plate with dry brisket and coleslaw, already wilting in the heat. She nodded toward a fold-out table near the shed. "That's where you can sit," she said, like she was doing me a favor. I sat, alone again. Plastic chair squeaking under the uneven weight of everything unsaid. Up front, under the big tent, the family was all clinking crystal glasses and dabbing sweat from their brows like they were at a royal function. Dylan stood near the microphone, a West Point blazer slung over one shoulder like a cape. "I've always believed in service," he said, eyes shining with just the right amount of performative sincerity. "Some folks in our family tried it, but I want to do more. Make a real difference." He didn't look at me. Not directly. But the pause before some folks was deliberate, a blade disguised as a compliment. The crowd erupted with applause. Someone whooped. Someone else yelled, "That's our future senator." I kept eating my cold food plastic fork, scraping the paper plate. A little boy, Dylan's son, I think, wandered over. Maybe 5 or 6. Curious eyes. "Are you not working?" he asked, innocent. I smiled like I used to in foreign interviews when the wrong question could get you killed. "I'm working," I said softly, "just not where people can see." Later, while helping clear tables, I ducked into the house for a glass of water. In the living room, I stopped cold. There had been a photo once of me. First year at Fort Bragg. Clean uniform, bright eyes, pride I hadn't yet learned to be careful with. It used to sit in the center of the family's display cabinet. Gone now. In its place, Dylan in full dress smiling at his West Point induction. New frame. Prime location. I turned to my mother, who was wiping down the nearby counter. "Where's my picture?" She didn't look at me. "Oh, it got dusty. Thought I'd put it away." "Where?" She paused. Somewhere, like me." I was rinsing out a chipped mug when I heard his voice. Clear, measured, familiar in that painfully practiced way. I turned toward the television, the morning news casting its usual light across the room, just in time to see Dylan's face fill the screen. He sat tall on one of those sleek studio couches, his new military coat too stiff across the shoulders, like he hadn't worn it long enough to earn the creases. The host leaned in, eyes full of reverence. "Tell us again, Captain Rowe. What made you move forward that night knowing the mission wasn't authorized?" And then he told my story, word for word. "We were stationed near the southern ridge of the Caucasus Mountains," he said. "There was chatter. Local engineers taken hostage. The intel was unclear, no backup in sight. But I had to make a call. I split the unit, took a risk, and we got everyone out." I stopped breathing. The way he said it, it wasn't just the summary. It wasn't a recycled rumor. He knew everything. The number of hostages, the elevation, the split unit maneuver, the flare decoy. Details only someone on the ground could know, or someone who had access to the original classified reports. The audience applauded like they had any idea what it meant, like they could possibly understand what it took to carry those children to reroute an evac team to disobey orders, because the only alternative was choosing who lived and who died. He didn't flinch. He didn't sweat. He looked right into the camera and took a story carved from my bones and wore it like a medal. I stood frozen, palms gripping the kitchen counter, until my knuckles went white. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I didn't move. Then I picked up the phone. "Did you see the show this morning?" I asked, skipping the hello. There was a long pause before my mother answered. "I did," she said carefully. "Dylan's been doing so well lately. He made the whole thing up." I said, my voice low too even. "He's never seen combat. He's never even crossed a national border in uniform." Another pause, this one colder. "You never told us what you really did, Rowan," she said finally. "People can only be proud of what they understand." I closed my eyes. There it was again. The excuse draped in softness, like I had hidden the truth instead of being denied the space to share it. "I tried," I whispered. "You all just didn't want to hear it." She didn't respond. I ended the call before the silence could stretch any further. Later that night, my secure line buzzed. Only a handful of people had that number. I answered without thinking. Rowan came the clipped, precise voice of Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Lake. "You need to hear this before it gets worse." "I'm listening." "There's chatter," she said. "Political channels. Something stirring about your refusal to comply with General Racine's drone directive back in 2018. Word is he hasn't forgotten." My stomach turned. I hadn't heard that name in years. "You think this is connected to Dylan?" "I don't think this is about family ego anymore," she said. "I think someone's using him, and your silence is the weapon." I sank into the chair, thoughts circling too fast to grab. The drone directive. The night I filed an internal report that vanished into bureaucratic oblivion. I'd refused to manipulate surveillance data for political leverage, and just like that, I'd been marked. Now somehow Dylan was suddenly parroting my classified missions on daytime television. "This isn't just about credit," I said slowly. "Someone's feeding him." "Exactly," Amanda said. "And it's someone with access to logs only cleared at level 6 and above. Dylan doesn't have that clearance. Not even close." A pit opened in my chest. Whoever it was, they weren't just repackaging my past. They were rewriting it. Giving it to someone easier to control. Someone safe. Someone who hadn't spent years learning when to disobey and why that mattered. I turned the volume back up on the interview. "Not about being a hero," Dylan said, shaking his head modestly. "It was about making the right call no matter the risk." He even had the gall to pause, to let the weight of it settle. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. I stared at the screen, my image flickering in the reflection behind his. I remembered every second of that night. The bitter wind, the metallic stench of blood and cold and fear, the scream of the evac rotor, the moment I radioed back, knowing it might be the last transmission I'd ever send. And now, it was his headline. I didn't feel angry. I felt violated. They'd stolen my past not to honor it, but to control it, to sterilize it. They couldn't bury me entirely, so they handed my truth to someone who wouldn't cause problems, someone who wouldn't raise questions. I stood in the dark of my apartment, the TV now silent, the glow still dancing across Dylan's smiling face. Then I opened my laptop. Because this wasn't just stolen valor, it was orchestration, and I was going to find out who'd written the script. The breach wasn't loud. No headlines, no classified leak panic on the news. Just a single cold email from the Department of Defense. Effective immediately. You are placed on temporary suspension, pending internal review for violation of Level 1 encryption protocol. No explanation, no signature, just a digital execution. I stared at the screen for a long time, the letters sharp and surgical. They were accusing me of something I hadn't done, accessing high-level encrypted files tied to autonomous drone warfare and surveillance ops. Files I hadn't touched in years. Files I no longer had clearance for. The source, a military-issue laptop I had turned in 3 years ago. It was supposed to be sealed, vaulted in an Army tech facility, wiped and buried beneath a dozen layers of internal firewalls. Now somehow it had resurfaced, been used to break open sensitive data strings, and left fingerprints. Mine. I didn't panic. Panic is for the untrained. I pulled up the last known access logs tracing IP echoes and device authentications. One after another, they stacked like dominoes falling through time, 7 unauthorized entries in the past 18 months. Each tied to high-profile operations I had once been part of, and each without fail, falsely authenticated through my biometric credentials. That was impossible. My ID was classified. Even most of my handlers didn't know my clearance chain. And yet, there it was. The terminal ID used for the breach tagged to a secure server block in Washington, D.C., more precisely within the private office network of General Abram Rassin. My stomach tightened. General Rassin, the same man who in 2018 had ordered me to falsify surveillance reports to cover up an experimental drone program that was quietly targeting congressional critics. When I refused, I filed an internal report. It was buried. He was promoted, and I was reassigned in silence. Now, 5 years later, someone inside his infrastructure was weaponizing my past. I didn't need more proof. I needed a firewall. Fast. So I reached out to the only person who owed me nothing, but still might answer, Marcus Vance. We hadn't spoken in years, but once during a joint deployment in Mali, I'd pulled him out of a digital kill box when every system marked him as expendable. He was brilliant, unstable, and always 2 lines of code away from either genius or treason. I texted him one word. Now. He responded in 6 minutes. Thought you were dead. Where do we start? We met in the back room of an old library we sometimes squatted in, using their dusty servers like a digital bunker. Within hours, he cracked into the encryption chains the military thought were ironclad. They cloned your ID, Marcus said, scrolling with fingers like weapons. Sloppy, but deep enough to fool anyone on the surface. They even masked the authentication logs, left just enough noise to frame you in case someone came digging. He paused. And Rowan, they've been leaking your file history. He turned the screen. A dozen threads lit up on a covert military message board popular among vets and self-styled patriots. Conspiracy-laced and private, but not unreachable. The name in all of them, MJR Delta. Each thread painted me as reckless, a rogue agent, a liability, the strategist who broke chain of command, the coward who risked her team to save herself, the woman who got people killed. None of it was true, but the details were close enough to sting. MJR Delta, I said aloud. That's the handle pushing this? Marcus nodded. Non-traceable on the surface. But I'm not done yet. He dove deeper, decoding user histories, server metadata, upload origin points. Slowly, the wall of misdirection began to crumble. We stared at a user profile stripped to its last layer. And there it was. A forgotten link, one that no civilian would ever know to look for an internal audit key, hidden inside the very first comment posted under the Delta Disgrace thread. That key was tied to a communications uplink at West Point. Specifically, an encrypted device registered to Dylan Rowe. I froze. No, I said out loud, though I already knew. Marcus sat back. You know that username, don't you? I do now. MJR. Not Major. MJR equals Midshipman Junior Reserve. Dylan's status at the time of the first leak. Delta, the operation I'd commanded, the one they'd tried to erase. He'd stolen my story, and then helped bury the original. But he hadn't done it alone. Dylan didn't have the clearance to access that laptop, but General Rassen's office did, which meant this was a two-man job. One traded legacy, the other leverage. Marcus leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" I looked down at the flickering screen. At my name. Twisted dragged through digital mud, and I made a choice. "I want the truth out," I said. "No more silence. Not one more inch. Because memory can be distorted. But truth doesn't die. It gets buried, until someone's willing to dig." It started with a camera feed. Marcus had stayed online combing through breadcrumbs. He didn't sleep much anyway. When he called, I could hear the low hum of server fans behind his voice. "Rowan," he said, "you might want to sit down for this. I'm already standing. Just tell me, your family's home security system was breached." My blood slowed. How long ago first ping was 6 weeks back. The intruder got access to their indoor motion sensors, routine logs, even external cams. Watched every movement from sunrise to bedtime. Someone studied your parents like a target package. I stared at the corner of my apartment where a worn photo of my mother sat tucked behind a stack of classified notes. She always said she hated cameras. Too many eyes in one house, she'd joke unplugging the baby monitor when we were kids. Now someone had turned her home into a fishbowl and watched. For weeks. "Where did it come from?" I asked steady. "The access came through a shell relay that bounces through about 6 countries. But the originating signature traces back to a laptop inside the Pentagon." Of course. More specifically, Rassen's comms division, Marcus confirmed. Device registered under a recent civilian consultant listed as Dylan Rowe. I couldn't breathe for a second. Not from shock, but from how little surprise I actually felt. "There's more," he said. "Your mother's hospital report, I got into the ER logs. It wasn't just a fall." "What do you mean?" "They listed it as a loss of balance, but the trauma pattern says impact. Blunt, maybe a push, maybe staged. Either way, whoever wrote the intake left gaps big enough to drive a truck through." I closed my eyes. The memory came back sharp and raw. My mother slumped on the porch steps, soot in her hair, barely conscious. The fire had taken half the barn, but not the house. She hadn't been burned, just collapsed. That's what they'd said. A simple fall. But now nothing felt simple. This wasn't just about my name anymore. Someone had crossed the line from erasing my career to putting hands or threats on my blood. "This is a message," I said. Marcus's voice lowered. "Yeah. They're not trying to just silence you, Rowan. They're trying to scare you quiet." I hung up and drove to the hospital that night. The halls smelled like antiseptic and old paint. My mother was sedated in a private room. Her heart monitor beeped slowly like a metronome, counting down everything we never said to each other. She didn't wake. But I sat with her anyway, long enough to remember the way her hands used to braid my hair tight before grade school, how she folded letters from my deployments, even though she never sent one back. Out in the waiting room, I found him. Dylan, seated alone, hunched over a vending machine coffee. His hair was too neat. His uniform was gone. Just a pale button-up and the guilt of someone who expected to be seen. "You knew," I said. He looked up fast like I'd struck him. What are you talking about?" "The breach," I said. "The security logs, the data trail. Your login gave away the access point that tracked our family's location. You handed it over." His eyes widened, not in denial, but in fear. "I didn't mean," he started. "You didn't mean to get caught," I interrupted. "But you did. And now Mom's in a hospital bed, and you're sitting here like nothing happened." He didn't speak, just stared down into the cheap coffee like maybe it could offer a way out. "I looked up your program entry," I said. "The communications division at the Pentagon. You don't just walk into that, you traded something." He flinched. "You gave them our family's data access to our movements, routines, vulnerabilities in exchange for a slot in Rassen's media rotation?" I continued. "That's what you're worth, huh? 1 seat and a spotlight, His voice cracked. I didn't know they'd hurt her, but you knew they wanted me gone. Silence settled between us like smoke. He didn't deny it, and that was enough. I turned away and walked down the hallway past the rooms and monitors and false promises of peace. No fire had touched my mother's skin, but someone had set something else ablaze. The part of me that still believed we were safe from the people who shared our name. They sent me the formal appeal documents the next day. The Department of Defense. A blank bureaucratic path back towards some sterile version of redemption. All I had to do was file an official rebuttal, submit evidence request, a formal inquiry. It was, in theory, the honorable route. I didn't even open the envelope, because I already knew what that route looked like. It ended with my story sanitized, edited by people in suits who never touched blood or dirt. It ended with the truth bartered into footnotes, reviewed behind closed doors, buried again. No. I needed something louder than paperwork, more permanent than clearance. I needed the truth exposed before they could erase the rest of it. So I went to the only person I trusted to wage a war without bullets, Marcus Vance. We met in the back room of a shuttered postal building, his latest hideout. The walls were lined with disconnected fiber cables and old maps of military server routes. It smelled like mildew and code. "You sure about this?" he asked, powering up his monitor stack. "Once we start, you won't be invisible anymore." "I was invisible when they framed me," I replied. "It didn't protect me then." He nodded, once solemn. "Then we go quiet, but deep. We didn't hack government firewalls or storm comm centers. That wasn't the mission. The mission was exposure leak, just enough to point the right people toward the story they tried to bury. So I contacted a name I hadn't said aloud in years. Sarah Kane, an investigative journalist, former war correspondent turned independent voice for forgotten conflicts. She didn't chase trending topics or viral moments. She dug, patiently, methodically, with empathy that unnerved even the people she tried to protect. She agreed to meet in a parking garage. No microphones, no recorders, just her notebook and the cold smell of concrete. "I'm not asking you to believe me," I told her. "I'm asking you to look where they told you not to." She studied me carefully. Her eyes didn't dart around like most reporters. She wasn't looking for headlines. She was reading me. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why not years ago?" "Because I still believed in the system," I said, "and I thought silence was safer." I was wrong on both counts. She flipped her notebook shut. "I'll look," she said, "but I won't guarantee a story. Not unless I find the truth. That's all I want." It took her 4 days. On the 5th morning she called me. "I found someone," she said. "You're going to want to hear this." His name was Jason Kane. I didn't recognize it at first, but when she said the words Hostage Caucasus Mountains Operation Orion Echo, I remembered. He was just a kid then, maybe 21, electrical engineer, shot in the leg. He'd clung to my arm the night I dragged him out of the second outpost. His face had been half covered in ash blood crusted over one eye. We'd exchanged no words, but he'd looked at me like he still wanted to live. Sarah patched him into a private call. "I don't know what happened after," Jason said quietly. "They told us a coalition unit got us out. But I remember her. She was the one who lifted me. She got us to the evac point." "You're sure?" Sarah asked. "I couldn't walk," he said. "She carried me on her back, bled through her jacket. Her badge read, Hale. I never forgot that name." Silence. Even after all these years, I hadn't expected it to matter. But it did. Jason wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a soldier. He was truth, undeniable, unfiltered. And he had nothing to gain. Sarah called back 2 hours later. "I've cross-referenced everything he said," she told me. "Medical reports, debrief summaries, private evac logs. They don't name you, but they line up. You were there. And you didn't just follow orders. You saved them." I didn't answer at first. I just sat on the floor of the library, surrounded by tangled cords and dust, staring at the laptop screen like it was a window back into that night. The sound of rotor blades, the stench of cold metal. The kid on my back saying nothing but holding on like life still had a debt to pay. Sarah's voice returned calm but firm. "I'm going to tell this story," she said. "But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because they've silenced too many others, and you're one of the few who can still speak." I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. "Then let's tell it." The night before this segment was set to air, the silence in my apartment felt deeper than usual. No ambient traffic, no creaking walls, just the quiet hum of Marcus's terminal and the distant sound of the wind outside. A stillness that always comes before something breaks. I was staring at Sarah's final fact-check email, everything ready to go. Verified sources, cross-referenced logs, survivor testimony. My name attached not to scandal, but to truth. Then my secure line buzzed. The message wasn't signed. No ID, no encryption. Just a link. I didn't click it, not immediately. I rerouted it through 3 scrubbing servers, air-gapped it, and ran a containment scan. When I finally opened it, the screen filled with static. Then a video. My father, tied to a chair in a warehouse, head covered in a black canvas sack. His shoulders slumped, feet bound. A single light swung overhead, casting sharp shadows across the cement floor. A voice followed, modulated, distorted. "If the broadcast airs, he dies." It was that simple. No list of demands, no opportunity to negotiate. Just an ultimatum. Below the video, a symbol appeared, a jagged circuit enclosed in a black sun. I'd seen it before on dark forums, buried in deep net reports, attached to surveillance alerts, flagged as low credibility. But it wasn't low anymore. They called themselves the Digital Independence Legion, a rogue cyber militia. Not a nation. Not an army. Something newer, more agile, and far more dangerous. They didn't want to take land. They wanted to dismantle the idea of democratic oversight altogether by seizing the one thing more powerful than any ballot or bullet control of decision-making intelligence. I called Marcus immediately. "They made a move," I said. "My father's gone. Where warehouse, cement, single bulb, somewhere industrial but isolated." He was already typing. Okay. I'll scrape city grids and match the shadows. But that's not the only thing I found." He hit a key. Another file opened on my screen. "Remember Adaptive Strike," he said. "The original build you worked on." My throat closed. "Of course I do." "Well, it's back. But not in the vault where it was supposed to rot. Someone's reactivated it, and it's been rewritten." He zoomed in on the code interface. "There's still a developer tag in the command stream." He highlighted it. "Creator LTNJ Hale. Tactical lead authorization, my name. Buried in the foundation of a weapon I thought I'd left behind. But I didn't build it like this," I said. "It was never meant to be autonomous. The human check-in layer was the entire point, target validation, moral oversight. Without that, it's just execution code." Marcus turned grim. "They stripped that layer. Someone's preparing it for black market deployment. And the Legion? They've already synced it to 3 satellite pathways." I sat down. Hard. I thought the worst thing that could happen was being forgotten. Turns out, it was being remembered for the wrong reasons. My legacy, what little of it had survived, was now the spine of an AI that could launch strikes without a single human approval. And they were using my father as a message. Stay quiet, or watch us weaponize everything you built. Then the second message came. Same sender. This time, no video. Just a name. Elena Vara. I hadn't spoken it in nearly a decade. She and I had trained together, mission analysts in the same strike division. Always one step behind me in ranking, but never in drive. She wasn't the type to seek command. She didn't crave recognition. She craved control. Elena knew the way systems worked, how praise was political, how truth got edited out. She used to say, "I don't want to be the face. I want to be the hand that moves the face." Now she'd become the fist behind a digital insurgency. And she'd done it by hijacking my life's work. The third and final file came in just after midnight. Encrypted coordinates, a live stream access point, a static preview image. And standing in the center of the frame behind my father face, shadowed, but voice clear, was Elena herself. "You taught them how to think ethically," she said. "I taught them how to win." Then she smiled, and the screen went black. I didn't go to the Pentagon. I didn't call any press conferences or step into the polished halls of power. The morning after the last video, after Elena Vara showed her face and signed her declaration of war, I met Marcus on a cold rooftop in Warsaw, where the frost clung to our boots and the sunrise came late. No words, just a nod. We were done with reacting. It was time to respond. The Legion had satellites, algorithms, code stitched together from stolen frameworks and warped into something weaponized. But what they didn't have, what they couldn't steal, was how I thought. My original design for Adaptive Strike had a buried substructure, a kind of fail-safe logic that never made it into documentation. A system so embedded in human ethics that it required moral variance to proceed. They had stripped it, but they hadn't removed the signature pathways. That was our thread. Marcus initiated the breach. I fed him the ghost code. Together we created a digital pressure wave, a cascade of corrupted feedback loops designed not to destroy, but to undo. Like overloading a nervous system with false emotion until it short-circuits itself. Within 90 minutes, the first strike queue froze. Within 2 hours, the command and response chain stuttered. By the third hour, Legion's satellite uplinks began to desync. And then it all collapsed. We didn't need to fire a shot. The AI imploded itself. Elena Vara didn't run. She tried to reset it manually. That's where Interpol caught her standing in the skeleton of her control room, shouting at servers that no longer listened. She was detained in Geneva by a joint task force. Her hands were bound. Her voice, for the first time in years, recorded in full fidelity. "I was always second," she hissed. "Rowan Hale didn't deserve what she built. But the cameras weren't on me. And I didn't need them to be." Dylan wasn't arrested, but he was brought in for questioning. The audit trail from his device to Rassen's office made its way to the Congressional Oversight Board. Leaks were unsealed. The story cracked open in slow, quiet waves. Breach of ethical protocol. Dereliction of digital responsibility. He was dishonorably discharged. Rank stripped. Access revoked. The media that once paraded him went silent overnight. The Pentagon sent me an envelope. Inside was a formal offer to reinstate my rank, this time with a promotion. Strategic Commander, the youngest female officer in U.S. history to ever be considered. I folded the letter once, then set it in the fire, because by then, I'd already won something better. That night I went home. Not to the apartment, not to the outposts or the field bases, to Missouri, the real home. My mother was recovering. She still walked with a cane, and her hair had gone grayer since the last time I saw her conscious, but her eyes were steady. We sat in silence for a long while on the back porch, watching the wind bend the tall grass, listening to a world that had no idea what almost happened. Then I remembered. The voicemail. I'd missed it buried under the flurry of alerts the night she was hospitalized. I played it alone. Her voice was soft, worn. "Rowan. I know I was never good with the right words, but I saw it, all of it. I saw what they did to you. I didn't say anything because I thought silence would keep you safe. But if you need me now, if you need me to speak, I will. I'll tell them what you did. I'll stand." I pressed my phone to my chest. That message wasn't for the court. It wasn't for the press. It was for me. For the girl who grew up thinking that being invisible was the safest way to belong. Now I knew better. I didn't need a spotlight. I needed witnesses, people who knew what had been built, and who I had refused to become. The building wasn't much, just red brick walls, sun-washed windows, and a plaque outside that read, "The Hale Institute for Strategic Ethics." It stood on old Missouri soil acres once owned by my grandfather. The cornfield had been cleared, the barns repurposed. Now it was a place where young officers came not to learn how to command, but to learn why they should. We didn't talk about rank much here. We talked about restraint, about the gray between duty and obedience, about what it meant to make decisions with lives hanging in the margins. We taught AI literacy, not just how to build or deploy it, but how to question it, challenge it, refuse it when it failed the human test. Our curriculum didn't shy away from classified scenarios. In fact, we used them scrubbed, redacted, anonymized, but raw. Not to sensationalize, but to show the cost of silence. Our motto was simple truth without ethics is just power pretending to be wisdom. I didn't wear a uniform anymore. Not since the day I turned down the Pentagon's offer. I wore a gray suit and worn boots and kept my hair tied back just like I did in the field. My voice was calm, my steps, even my posture still impossibly straight. I didn't need medals to command a room. My students didn't salute. They listened. And that was more than enough. Each semester I started with one question written on the board. What would you refuse to do no matter who ordered it? And at the end of the course I always left them with one answer. That morning I stood before them again. The lecture hall was filled, cadets from Annapolis, junior analysts from NATO, even 2 quiet observers from NGOs working on conflict AI governance. And at the back of the room, hands folded neatly in her lap, was my mother. She had made the journey from her hospital bed to this moment. She hadn't said much when she arrived, just placed her hand over mine and whispered, "I see you now, all of you." That was all I ever needed. I cleared my throat and stepped up to the board. I looked at these young minds, restless, principled, still unsure where idealism ends and compromise begins. And I said, "Command isn't about control. It's about conscience. You'll be told that the data speaks, that the code is neutral, that the mission justifies the means. And in those moments you must remember something systems can't teach you who you are when no one is watching." The room was silent. No one took notes. They just listened. And then in slow, deliberate strokes, I wrote the final line on the board. "You don't need applause to matter. Just live true." I didn't turn to look at their reaction. I didn't need to. Because I wasn't here to be celebrated. I was here to plant something quieter than pride, stronger than reputation, deeper than rank. After the lecture, I stood alone in the hallway, watching the light shift across the floor. The voices inside the classroom rose gently, curious, engaged, awake. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the one thing I still carried. Not a badge, not a medal. Just a burned fragment of my original code, now etched into a smooth piece of glass. The ethical override module, the one they'd removed, the one that had collapsed their entire operation when reintroduced. I held it in my hand like a truth no one could edit. Outside, a group of students gathered beneath the tree line. One of them laughed softly. Another was crying. Not because they'd lost anything, but because for once they felt like they mattered without having to be seen. I didn't go out there. I just stayed by the window watching. Because this was the mission now. Not war, not revenge, not recognition. Just building a world where integrity wasn't retroactive, where the right thing wasn't something you had to bury or apologize for, where you didn't need applause to matter. You just had to live true.